James McCune Smith. Liked to keep up with the news, he liked to keep up with current events. He read omnivorously. He read one of the 250 second printing copies of Moby Dick. And he thought the officers of the new Republican Party were like the officers of the Pequod. Some things never change. So when Charles Darwin wrote about evolution and the survival of the fittest, James McCune Smith read about it before most people in New York had ever heard of Charles Darwin. And when they asked him why the name Smith came up so often in the New York City street directories, he said, well, Charles Darwin explains it. It's the survival of the fittest. Out of all these Smiths, why are so few remembered? In American history, you have John Smith at Jamestown. And that's it. Well, Al Smith in 1928. But name me another famous Smith.
Garrett Smith.
But we're here to single out names that should be remembered. And the name Smith is high on the list. When the black leadership of America came together in Rochester in 1853 for the last in a series of black American conferences before the Civil War, James Pennington presided, Frederick Douglass provided the oratory, and James McCune Smith used that occasion to organize, to produce the committees and the system that were going to carry out the work of that convention. When they got to that point, they chose James McCune Smith to be president of an ongoing National Council of Black Americans. Smith once likened his role to that of the tiny creatures that build up a coral reef over centuries. And here again, we need to notice that the first important study of coral reefs had been published just 6 years earlier in England by Charles Darwin. But Smith had read it, and it gave him a way to look at the long, slow process of changing American lives. He said, this kind of work suits me because it is very hard and somewhat noiseless. In the series of metempsychoses, I must have had a coral insect for a milio grandfather, loving to work beneath the tide in a superstructure that someday, when the laborer is long dead and forgotten, may rear itself above the waves and afford rest and habitation for the creatures of the good Father of all. How many leaders do we have who love to work beneath the tide? But it's an appropriate analogy, especially for someone named Smith. Specifically, here's an example of that invisible toil. Between January 1st and November 15th, 1855, 10.5 months, James McCune Smith presided at 24 significant meetings, not including probable monthly meetings of the vestry of St. Philip's Church, and not including the inevitable planning meetings and committee meetings in relation to that list of meetings, important enough to be noticed in printed records. In most of them, Smith was either presiding or serving as secretary. Most of those meetings were held outside New York City, in Syracuse, Troy, Boston, Philadelphia. It would have taken the better part of the day, both going and coming back. 3 of the meetings took place over 3 days. And of course, Smith was still keeping up a medical practice. Few black Americans in those days had the skills needed to create and lead committees, to do the dull organizational work that makes things happen. Smith himself had neither time enough or charisma to accomplish all the goals that he and others set. But the efforts made and the lessons learned did build the coral reef that finally rose above the waves to assert a black presence that today is reshaping America, as Smith knew it would. Well, I'm sorry, my pages are out of order. let's go back to the beginning. James McCune Smith was born in New York City in 1813. He was born in slavery, which was still legal in New York State in 1813. Until in 1813, he was 5 years older than Frederick Douglass, 6 years older than James Pennington. He grew up in the abysmal Five Points area of New York City, raised by a single mother, a self-emancipated black mother. We'll come back to that. Lavinia Smith. Lavinia Smith knew that she was pregnant in mid-October 1812. She wasn't surprised. She was surprised only it hadn't happened sooner. Her owner had brought her and her 3 older sisters north from South Carolina to New York City as his slaves 8 years earlier. One by one, the 3 older sisters had migrated back to South Carolina. South Carolina, New York, it didn't matter, you were a slave either place in those days, but in South Carolina they had friends. So Lavinia, at age 18, was left alone with her owner, Samuel Smith, who had come to New York hoping to make money trading and buying and selling cotton. Unfortunately, he wasn't very good at his trade, and after about 8 years he was living in a battered apartment in the worst part of the city, and coming home drunk to beat Lavinia. She could put up with it for herself, but she had made up her mind not to raise a child in that environment. He came home drunk the day she knew she was pregnant, went upstairs to get his whip. "Come up here," he yelled. She faced him from the bottom of the stairs. "If you dare touch me with that whip," she said, "I will tear you to pieces." Well, he was a good deal bigger than she, and he could whip her easily. But he wouldn't fight a woman, even a black woman. He slunk out of the house and was gone. James McCune Smith was born 6 months later on April 18, 1813. Technically, he was a slave, so was his mother. But his father knew better than to assert any claim of ownership. He may never have known that he had a son. But James knew who his father was, and he entered the name Samuel Smith, merchant, when he had to provide his father's name on a form. James McCune Smith described his mother as self-emancipated. Some slaves managed to buy their freedom. Lavinia simply asserted hers. But if she was to be free, she had to find a way to make a living. Samuel Smith had not been a great breadwinner, but he did keep a roof over their heads and food on the table. Lavinia, at age 18, had never had to support herself. She did the laundry, she did the cooking, but she was a slave. She worked for her owner without being paid. So how would she survive now with a child on the way? Lavinia talked to her friends about it. The Five Points neighborhood had a reputation as the worst in New York City, but friends in such a neighborhood support each other to survive. And Lavinia had friends who told her that she could make some money by taking in people's laundry. She could also mend clothes. It wasn't easy work, especially in the months just before and after James was born, but Lavinia could do it. And she could eke out a living for herself and for the baby. It was never easy. Years later, James would write an essay about a washerwoman that would give readers a glimpse of his life in those days. He didn't identify his mother as the washerwoman, but it seems to be her life that he was exactly describing. He wrote like an eyewitness about a woman whose apartment was filled with wash tubs and drying clothes. He wrote about the sound of the iron being dunked. Dunk, dunk goes the iron, sadly, wearily, but steadily, as if the very heart of toil were throbbing in penultimate beats. Dunk, dunk, and that small and delicately formed hand and wrist swell up with knotted muscles and bursting veins. Smith also described a good-for-nothing looking quarter-grown, bushy-headed boy in the apartment, a shade or two lighter than his mother, who had to be called several times before he sprang into action to put some more wood on the fire or light another candle or bring another pail of water. It's not hard to imagine that the boy's name was James, and that the scene witnessed by that boy was the home where he grew up. Slavery was still legal in New York until 1827. Smith was 14 when it ended, and he well remembered the triumphal parade down Fifth Avenue to celebrate the event. But meanwhile, Smith had gotten an excellent elementary education. The Quakers had created a school for black children, and the white headmaster liked to boast that the children of his school could match the children of any other white school in the city. But the black children had no further steps available when they finished that education. Smith was a star student. When General Lafayette came back to America in 1824 to revisit the country that he had helped create and to visit the so-called African school, they called on James McCune Smith at the age of 11 to make a little speech of welcome on behalf of the students. That speech, brief as it was, made such a hit that they sent Smith down to Philadelphia to say it again and gave him $5 for doing it. That is more like $150 today. That's a nice piece of change for an 11-year-old kid. And that was all very well, but when Smith did graduate from the African school, what future did he have? He wanted to be a doctor. Well, there were no high schools or colleges for black students. Smith was an Episcopalian. Columbia University and Hobart College upstate had medical schools, and there were Episcopal schools. But James Smith was black, and that was all that mattered. It did make a difference, however, in another way. One of Smith's friends had led him to St. Philip's Church, whose pastor, Peter Williams, was the second black priest ordained in the Episcopal Church. And he thought this kid deserved a chance. So while Smith pumped the bellows in a blacksmith's shop, holding his Latin text in one hand so he could pump with the other, his pastor raised the money. It took 4 years to send James McCune Smith to Glasgow, where in 5 years he earned a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a doctor's degree. A medical degree from the University of Glasgow, one of the best colleges and medical schools in the whole world, better certainly than anything in New York. Smith was ready for the challenge. In his first year, he won the Latin prize. In his second year, he won a prize in logic. And after 5 years, he graduated with high honors and came back to New York City better qualified than perhaps any other doctor in the town. Well, that's not saying a lot. The stethoscope had not yet been invented, let alone the thermometer. And one of the jobs of a teacher in those days was to sell leeches and show people how to apply them. Doctors also knew how to do cupping and bleeding and tooth drawing and other things you don't want to know about. But Smith knew there was more to learn, and he wrote up his cases so that he and others could learn from experience. We gave this person a dose of mercury, and this is what happened. And he actually managed to get at least one case published in the New York Journal of Medicine under the name of a white doctor. The Smith came back to New York to a welcome equal to the astronauts, a welcome back gathering in the Broadway Tabernacle, the biggest church in the city. It would accommodate 2,400 people, and they were there to welcome him. And then they made him go up to Troy to be welcomed again. So that was all very good, but Smith came back to a world that had changed in his absence. There had been a fire in 1835 that destroyed much of the city. The flames could be seen in Philadelphia. And there had been riots that destroyed St. Philip's Church, destroyed the rector's home. But there had also, in his absence, been a meeting of men like William Lloyd Garrison and Lewis Tappan and Peter Williams to form the American Anti-Slavery Society. So the landscape had changed in more ways than one. It so happened that another fugitive from the South had arrived in New York just at that very same time. A man named Frederick Bailey. Bailey would change his name to Frederick Douglass and become a close colleague of Smith. James Pennington also came back to New York that year to be pastor of a black Presbyterian congregation. And at just that same time, the Colored American, a weekly newspaper published in New York City, published a letter from a man called Gerrit Smith, writing from Peterboro, New York, to ask, "What can we at the North do toward abolishing slavery in the South? One thing we can do, we can throw down its greatest prop by purging our hearts of this monster prejudice." Not that simple. Gerrit Smith had trouble doing it himself, but he was asking the right questions and pointing to the problem of prejudice in the North. James McCune Smith, Gerrit Smith, Frederick Douglass, lives coming together to make a difference. The two Smiths met for the first time the following spring, 1838, when the newly formed American Abolition Society met in New York. And they put one black speaker on the program, James McCune Smith. They asked him to talk about progress in overcoming slavery in Britain and France. It's the first time I've done this, and I'm getting things out of order all the time. I'm sorry. The American Abolition Society met in New York in 1835, and they invited one black speaker on the program, James McCune Smith. And Smith talked to them about the problem of prejudice in the North. That wasn't what they'd asked him to talk about, but that was what he knew needed to be dealt with. He was at that point helping to edit a newspaper. He was being called on to speak on major occasions. And in 1837, he traveled to Boston. I'm skipping a couple of years for some reason. He traveled to Boston in 1837 to make a speech which he titled, "The Destiny of the People of Color." What was the future, Smith asked, of the black population of the United States? Reading his answer, names spring to mind. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, but many others as well. James Weldon Johnson, Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, Booker T. Washington, Duke Ellington, Ralph Ellison, Lorraine Hansberry, Barack Obama, Louis Armstrong, Maya Angelou, George Washington Carver, Kamala Harris, Steph Curry. No, you San Francisco, I got a response to that. But the list today is endless. And none of them were names known clearly to James McCune Smith. Smith knew only a few names. Phyllis Wheatley, a poet. Benjamin Banneker, an astronomer and a scientist. He could not have known those other names still to come. But speaking in Boston in 1841, 27 years old, he prophesied. He foresaw their existence. Smith would go on to produce great literature himself, but at the age of 27, he prophesied a future for black Americans that went far beyond what anybody else had seen. First, Smith contended, the colored people of America, unlike the Jews in Egypt, would be set free from bondage without leaving the enslaving society. Living in a republic, they would find their freedom within its borders. An important point, over 100 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. would give an audience in Washington the same dream. Freedom would be found within this republic, indeed in the same places where black people had been most oppressed. Go back to Mississippi, King told his audience on the Mall. Go back to Alabama, go back to South Carolina, go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana, go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. And although they named different features of the country they inhabited, surely Smith and King had a shared vision. King said it this way, "Let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York." But you know that passage. But Smith put it this way, The time must come when from the Aroostook to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic to where the Pacific calmly laves the shores of Oregon, there shall go forth a blast from the trump of freedom, at which our chains shall be broken, our fetters fall, and the American people, swelling beyond the limits in which pride and prejudice have bound them, shall become the free and equal participants of one government, one destiny. But try reading some of those phrases when a random group of Americans asked, who said that? The answer would almost certainly be Martin Luther King Jr. One wonders whether King had been reading Smith. But maybe Lincoln had been reading Smith also, because Smith went on to point out that the institution of slavery is based on the doctrine that might makes right. Smith said, we are not in a position of physical superiority, yet we must overcome the doctrine that might makes right. 17 years later, an almost unknown railroad lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, came to the Cooper Union in New York to make his case for the Republican nomination in 1860 and told his audience they must have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. Smith said it first. Smith argued that the colored people must remain where they were and await liberty on the soil of their birth, and so prove the common equality of the human family and common brotherhood of man. It's not time to read Smith's whole speech, but it's the stunning final paragraph and a half in which Smith came to the essence of his vision. For we are destined to write the literature of this republic, which is still in letters a mere province of Great Britain. We have already, even from the depths of slavery, furnished the only music which the country has yet produced. We are also destined to write the poetry of the nation, for as real poetry gushes forth from minds imbued with a lofty perception of the truth, so our faculties, enlarged in the intellectual struggle for liberty, will necessarily become fired with glimpses at the glorious and the true, and we will weave their inspiration into song. We are destined to produce the oratory of this republic. For since true oratory can only spring from honest efforts in behalf of the right, such will of necessity arise amid our struggle. No holiday speeches in which shall be uttered eloquent falsehoods, garnished untruths and hollow boasting of a state of things which exist only in the imagination, but on the contrary, we shall utter the earnest pleadings of downtrodden humanity, seeking security from wrongs too long inflicted, no longer to be endured. In fine, we are destined to spread over our common country the holy influence of principles, the glorious light of truth. John Stauffer, who has edited and published much of Smith's writing, says of this speech that Smith, in effect, envisioned a Zion in America, where blacks raised up by God could create a new city upon a hill. Perhaps we could go even further and say that Smith was suggesting that only when black Americans were able to participate freely in the building of that city could it become for all its inhabitants the shining beacon the founders had envisioned. Smith, we might say, had a dream. By the end of 1841, James McCune Smith had been back in the United States for less than 4 years. But in that time, he had established a medical practice, given public lectures on a wide variety of subjects, helped edit a weekly newspaper, taken a leading role in the political concerns of black Americans, and in late November, he had taken part in a mass meeting on the subject of the elective franchise. Under New York state law, all male citizens of 21 years were eligible to vote. But if you were black, you needed to have $200 worth of property. Smith spent countless days organizing protests and testifying to state legislative committees in Albany. The committees would recommend again and again favorably to the legislature, only to get voted down again and again. Nothing changed until the Civil War. Those were the things Smith was doing. But Smith was only human. In December 1841, the colored American reported our learned friend, Dr. James McCune Smith, now lies very low with inflammation of the lungs. Well, that diagnosis could cover a wide range of diseases from asthma to cancer, but when his illness became disabling 20 years later, the diagnosis was pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the tissues surrounding the lungs. What happened next in 1841 is unknown because the Colored American, which paid close attention to the doings of James McCune Smith and his friends, ceased publication at the end of the year after that issue. But we know that Smith's health was a continuing problem, and need to remember that amid the flurry of his activities, still there was this weakness developing. We should also remember that he had a family, and that he and his wife produced 10 children, of whom 5 died young. There was one span of 6 weeks in a cholera epidemic, during which 3 of his children died, not all at once, but painfully, first one, then another, and then another. In March of the following year, 6 months later, he wrote to Gerrit Smith, "The first sharp bitterness is past, but oh, it is sad to have no children playing around the hearthstone. I try, and may God give me the grace to succeed, to look into other little glad eyes and listen to other little glad voices, and I try to reason myself out of the selfishness that they are not mine. Oh, that meeting hereafter." That McCune Smith could write such a letter to Gerrit Smith tells us something about the depth of their relationship. So let me zero in on that relationship between the two Smiths and the one rather special project that they worked on together. Gerrit Smith had met James McCune Smith, as I said, in May of 1840 at the convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society that ended in a division of the society. But Gerrit Smith, having met him, asked him to write a letter of encouragement to the colored men of the state. But when McCune Smith thought about it, the bleak reality of their situation overwhelmed him. He wrote back to Gerrit Smith, "I have not heart to write it. Each succeeding day, that terrible majority falls heavier and heavier, more crushingly, on my soul. At times I am so weaned from hope that I could lay me down and die with the prayer that the very memory of this existence should be blotted from my soul. There is in that majority a hate deeper than I had imagined. Laboring under these views, I cannot write a cheering word and will not write a discouraging one." But he would support Gerrit Smith in one enormous project, imagined by Gerrit Smith, whose father had left him thousands of acres of land, much of it in the Adirondacks. Gerrit Smith proposed to give away large tracts of that land, 140,000 acres, in 40-acre lots, to black men who would take it up and become independent, self-supporting farmers. James McCune Smith agreed to become the New York agent of that project and coordinate the giving of title to applicants. The project was doomed from the start. To give a man 40 acres is a fine thing, but Western settlers knew you needed 40 acres and a mule. And arable acres, not mountainsides. Much of the land was up around Lake Placid, which is a great site for the Winter Olympics, but not so much for farming. Eventually, over 3,000 titles were distributed, and some of the grantees did move north. Men who had been coachmen and barbers and waiters and cooks set out to try to wring a living from the land. But not only was the land unfriendly, so were also some of the neighbors. Local people would offer to guide the newcomers to their land, but sometimes show them barren rocks and then offer them a few dollars for their deeds. A sworn statement by a certain Elijah Jones testified to the local animosity. Jones himself was a supporter of the project. He testified, and I quote, "There exists in this community much opposition and against the lands being settled by colored people. I've heard the white inhabitants accuse Mr. Smith of trying to ruin the town by getting colored people to settle in this town." James McCune Smith himself accepted title to land in Timbuktu, as it was called, journeyed north in September of 1849 to see it. Writing months later to Gerrit Smith, he told him, "I felt myself a lord indeed, beneath the lofty spruce and maple and birch, and by the trawling brook which your deed made mine, and would gladly exchange this bustling, anxious city life for the repose of that majestic country. The land was beautiful, he wrote, but he could not live there himself because he could not serve as doctor to so small a community, nor raise his children in a place where there was no school. In 2002, a local historian in this area told a writer for the New York Times, the thing was over in no time. Within 20 years, most of the families were gone. It just wasn't a successful enterprise. It's a sad story. There were such good intentions, so little to show for it. At just the same time, however, another enterprise was being launched with much greater success. Frederick Douglass had returned to the United States from 2 years abroad to launch his own newspaper. In Rochester, New York. And he asked James McCune Smith to write a column for his paper. And somehow Smith found the time to take on one additional chore and wrote a weekly column, mostly under a pseudonym. Sometimes he called himself Communipaw, and other times he called himself Wapanumak, which is Communipaw spelled backwards. Smith was happy to have, Communipaw, as the image developed, was an older, more serious commentator, and Wapanumak was a younger, more radical voice. So Smith had two voices with which to write his columns and to weigh in on current affairs and add his voice to the debate over slavery and abolition. And writing under a pseudonym seems to have freed Smith to express himself in ways he might not have done otherwise. Smith and Douglass disagreed on one thing, and that was Smith's insistence on writing about ordinary people. James McCune Smith, writing as Communipaw, was at his most innovative and controversial. In a series of columns he wrote for Frederick Douglass's paper titled Heads of the Colored People. He wrote 10 columns with that title at intervals over a space of almost 3 years. Portrait number 1, dated March 25th, 1852, was the black news vendor, a man selling newspapers on the street corner for a few pennies. He had been a sailor, but his legs had been frozen so badly in a storm they had to be amputated. Undeterred, the man had made a new life for himself, and he still had ambitions. He hoped to find a place indoors to sell papers and stationery. Already he had a wife and a family and a decent income. Wasn't that something to be celebrated? But Douglass didn't want that kind of column, and his readers wanted columns about prosperous black people, not these ordinary people that Smith wanted to write about. Smith sometimes felt himself to be, as he put it, alone, all alone. And never more so than when he looked at the New York Tribune of August 12, 1857, and saw that his good friend Gerrit Smith had written in general agreement with Horace Greeley's statement in that paper that, quote, the mass of the blacks are ignorant and thriftless, and etc. I think you are sometimes too harsh, Gerrit Smith had written to Greeley, but I agree with you in the main. It was 8 months before James McCune Smith could write again, calmly and forgivingly, to the only white man he considered a friend. But when he did, the following April, he saluted him as usual, dear friend, and began with an apology for his long silence. He had been anxious, he said, about the health of his wife, had paid little attention to anything except the call of business. But that concern had been only the last 2 months, and Gerrit Smith's letter had been published 8 months earlier. Smith allowed himself adequate time to ponder a reply. And when at last he was able to write, he left no doubt how he felt. Greeley had written, Smith reminded his friend, that there are more blacks in this city who seek to make a living by harlotry, rum selling, and other modes of pandering to others than by downright honest labor. You will at once perceive, Smith wrote, that by agreeing in the main, You endorsed this foulest charge against us that could have been uttered. It was also, he wrote, very false. Smith knew how to do research, and he'd studied the census numbers, and he had the facts at his fingertips. He knew that in both New York and Philadelphia, there were fewer black paupers than white. It seemed to me last August, Smith told his friend, it seems to me still, that the heaviest blow we blacks could possibly receive came from your hand. You surely owed it to your own fame, to say nothing of us, to have ascertained by the widest examination of the facts that your statement was true before you ventured to make it. I have always been of the belief, he went on, that you had a heart, a belief which this reckless statement has greatly staggered. But Smith thought differently of his upstate friend than of other white men who also claimed to be friends of black people and had never made such a charge as that Greeley had made and that Gerrit Smith had endorsed. Gerrit Smith, on the other hand, as McCune Smith knew from his own experience, made friends without regard for color, and if he erred, he could be corrected. With Gerrit Smith, McCune Smith could even inject a note of humor in his rebuke. I must really come up to Peterboro, he wrote, and osculate your chest in order to reassure my faith. What Smith was offering with that statement was to make use of the very latest medical technology, to examine the state of his friend's heart with a stethoscope. That the familiar binaural stethoscope, now the identifying badge of a doctor, had just been invented in 1851 in Great Britain, and its use to diagnose cardiac problems and other internal issues could not yet have been common. But if Smith used one on his friend, he expected that he would hear a sympathetic heartbeat, or at least one that could be corrected if it missed a beat or two occasionally. He told his friend he would love to spend a day or two with you, and would be glad to have a long talk with you about our people. And he ended as usual, my wife joins me in best regards to yourself and family. Sincerely and respectfully yours, James McCune Smith. Time had passed, and the bitter disappointment that must have come with the reading of Gerrit Smith's letter to the Tribune had been softened by its passage. And with that passage of time, McCune Smith had returned to his earlier sense of Gerrit Smith as someone who did, at the deepest level, and in spite of a careless lapse into the pervasive bigotry of his time, respect him and other black Americans as a man and a brother whose friendship had value. And Gerrit Smith fortunately saved McCune Smith's letters to him, and they make fascinating reading. He didn't, unfortunately, save his own. His response to McCune Smith's letter would have made interesting reading. Smith's health deteriorated as the Civil War approached. He continued to write, but he was confined more and more to his home. He lived to see the Civil War won, but died 7 months after Lee's surrender on November 27, 1965, at the age of 52. Frederick Douglass wrote of him, the cause of his people lost when he died. He was never among the timid who thought me too aggressive and wished me to tone down my testimony to suit the times. A brave man himself, he knew how to esteem courage in others. James McCune Smith, as I said, had once compared his work to that of the insects that build up a coral reef and work beneath the tide in a superstructure that someday, when the laborer is long dead and forgotten, may rear itself above the waves and provide rest and habitation for the creatures of the good Father of all. The building or coral reef that Smith worked on throughout his life was, as he once described it, a nation in which our chains shall be broken, our fetters fall, and the American people, swelling beyond the lengths in which pride and prejudice have bound them, shall become the free and equal participants of one government, one destiny. The coral reef of that vision would indeed grow beneath the surface for another century and more, and it is not yet solidly above the waves. By the time it is, perhaps Smith and Pennington and Douglas will indeed be dead and forgotten. But if some do then look back, they will learn that few Americans spoke more eloquently or worked so tirelessly to attain that destiny as did James McCune Smith. So I may have told you all I know, but you could try to test me and see whether there's anything that I could say. Good. Yes.
Did James McCune Smith ever come to Albany, New York? Did he
Sorry?
ever come to Albany, New York?
Did I come on?
Did he go to Albany, New York?
Did Smith ever go to Albany, New York?
Yes.
Well, he probably, yeah, yes, of course he did. He testified to Senate committees in the New York State Legislature. Yeah, he came to Troy several times. There's a thriving black congregation in Troy. But yeah, he came to New York. He would testify. There was a verbatim record of the testimony given by Smith to the committee and the questions and so on asked by the members of the Senate. Some of the most ignorant comments you ever heard made by some of the members of our distinguished state Senate. But as I said, he won them over. But they went to the assembly, the full body, and they hadn't heard Smith, and they voted down again and again. Yes.
How was he received by, I don't know if he had medical colleagues, but the medical community of New York?
Did I say that he did case studies,
Yeah.
and one of them was published in the New York Journal of Medicine under the name of a white doctor. So yeah, he had white colleagues, and you know, it was the experience of two doctors in treating the same patient. So yeah, there was some openness to allowing him to work with that community. Yeah. Yes.
Was there any reference to a Thomas Elkins in any of your research?
Any reference to?
Thomas Elkins.
It's not a name I recognize, no. Yes.
How long have you spent researching the story?
Sorry?
How long did it take you to research the story and write the story?
Years and years. Well, I was here 8 years ago to talk about James Pennington, and I had not yet begun working on McCune Smith. But yeah, there are amazing resources available. There were a group of scholars that put together what they called Black Abolitionist papers. Everything that they could find anywhere became grist for their mill, and it's on microfilm. And I could go from where I live in San Francisco across to Berkeley, and in the Berkeley Library look at microfilm endlessly. Some of that has now been printed out. I think it's available in hardcover. It's a whole lot simpler. But well, let's say it's less than 8 years ago that I began working on Smith, and a couple of years ago that I finished working on Smith, but it's been a struggle finding a publisher, which I don't understand at all. The biography of Pennington got a long review in the Wall Street Journal. But when they came back with another biography by the same author, they weren't interested. The same publisher that had published the Pennington biography. So finally we found a publisher, university publisher, who was willing to take it and excited about it and hoping to get it out. It should be in print, I could say any day now, a week or two. Yes?
The relationship between James McCune Smith and Garrett Smith has always fascinated me.
Yes.
If only because it was the juxtaposition of two elite, well-educated men who were from different races Garrett grew up in an environment, a cultural environment that marinated him in racism, especially through his father and his male peers as a young man. And he learned well, I think, throughout his life how to control it. It doesn't mean that he was ever void of racist thoughts, but he was pretty well void of racist actions.
Yes, yes.
And I'm going to do more on this myself later.
Yeah, and his ability to work with James McCune Smith and others in the Radical Abolition Party, for example, that they founded, nominated Garrett Smith for president. James McCune Smith presided at that convention.
Right.
The first time a black American had presided at a national political convention. So, yeah, they were quite capable of working together,
Yeah.
but Garrett Smith was a victim of his times and his upbringing.
I'm
He
sorry.
rose above it, but it wasn't always easy. It's fascinating. I wish there were more documentation. Many of James McCune Smith's letters to Garrett Smith, and my wife and I hope that you and your wife will come and have tea with us on your next visit to the city.
Aw.
There's no way, there's no record of whether Garrett Smith ever did that. But that would have been a remarkable step if he and his wife had accepted hospitality from a black man and woman. We know they were invited, we don't know whether they went.
One last question.
Yeah.
Who are you working on now for your third?
I'm working on a biography of John Francis Shelley, who was mayor of San Francisco in the early 1960s. As I live in San Francisco, it's a lot easier to research. But John Shelley had been a state senator and then a member of Congress before he was mayor of the city. So he was involved at several levels of political life. And he was a member of the state senate in 1941-42 when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor paralyzed a lot of American brains. And you probably know that our country made 100 million Americans of Japanese origin move out of the coast at least 100 miles into concentration camps for the duration of World War II. When the motion to take that action came to the state senate, 40 members of the state senate voted on it, one voted against it, John Shelley. 3 years later, the war was winding down and there were these Japanese, are they going to come back? And a member of the Senate introduced a resolution opposing any return of the Japanese to the coast. John Shelley went off to a nearby veterans hospital, found 2 or 3 Nisei veterans with a lost arm or leg or something, brought them back and introduced them to the Senate. The resolution disappeared. Nothing ever happened. But he took some remarkable actions, and that intrigued me.